And finally, our discussion of contemporary African art. So we're going to talk about some actual African artists, and we're also going to talk about African American artists as well as some other diasporic African artists. I will talk about Yinka Shonibare, for instance, who is British African, we might say, or is diasporically moving between the two places. So you can see how identity gets really interesting as far as labeling is concerned. And for me, I think this is all about identity, right? It's all about, how do you go beyond something as horrific as slavery? And then how do you forge new identities after that? So when I look at these contemporary artworks, I kind of see these two things as being part of what a lot of these artists are exploring. I think, identity is a huge part of certain artists' reasons, right, for making what they're making. And I think really since the 80s, that's become more and more embraced to say, identity art is kind of where it's at. So when I look at these contemporary artists, I see that very commonly, right? They're kind of pulling from their own backgrounds, their own heritages, rather than being very formalistic about what they create. So we'll look at some works that think about how do you move past slavery, right? How do you look at that narrative, and then how do you dispel it? How do you create new power from it, right? How do you sort of unchain yourself from that narrative, might we say? How do you use it as a source of power, right, to create interesting imaging and interesting celebration of culture? So this is Betty Saar, and she's an artist that really started working in like the late 60s, early 70s, and she uses a very unique approach, which we call shadow boxing, where these are three-dimensional objects. May not be so easy to tell in the image, but there's a depth to them, and it's literally like a box filled with, a sculptural object, different sculptural objects and such, kind of the cotton at the bottom, right, to create a three-dimensional kind of feeling to the piece. So we call this shadow boxing. Saar does it. Another famous shadow boxer is Joseph Cornell, who does this method. So you'll notice she creates kind of this 3D layering, and this piece deals with imagery related to Aunt Jemima. And for years, I used to talk about, have you guys really thought about Aunt Jemima? And then this summer, it was like someone finally said, yeah, we're going to start to think about Aunt Jemima. And I was like, oh, finally, these kind of embedded commercial images that become just part of our landscape, and like a lot of people just skim right over them. They don't think about like what they really mean. I've always been startled by Aunt Jemima. When I see her in a grocery aisle, like, how did this ever get approved? Like, how is this still around? And then I would say to my mom, isn't this kind of like whatever? And she'd be like, what do you mean? I'm like, she's just not thinking about it that way. It's not like she's, being terrible. She's learned to gloss over it in her mind, might we say. So I'd ask my students, have you thought about this? And, often a lot of them be like, yeah. And a lot of them are like, what do you mean? And I'm like, well, she's kind of a mammy. She's shown as this mammy on a plantation, cooking up pancakes. It's a little bit disturbing. So, this summer, of course, the company that controls this brand, I forget the company, but they were like, okay, no more Aunt Jemima. And I was like, thank you. And then I was like, when are you coming for Uncle Ben next? And then that was like, 2 days later. And I was like, thank you. Right? I mean, these are not necessary advertising symbols. We can do better, right? To advertise things like syrup, pancakes, and rice. So Saar, I think what she was trying to do in her own time was to take these type of images, show you the stereotypes, because you'll notice that she uses like a blackface figure for the sculptural form, and then think about how she could show you the reality, perhaps. Like the painted image to me always seems a little closer to like maybe this was the situation these women were in, taking care of these squalling white babies, of the plantation owners. And then giving you the advertising symbology as well as kind of powerful symbols like the guns and the Black Power fist. And to me, she's activating a kind of energy, right, with the piece and having you think about what's your relationship to a lot of these stereotypical images? Do you know them or understand them? Do you accept them? Do you reject them and such? Aunt Jemima, by the way, over the years, she got lighter skin toned. And they've done a lot of studies about skin tonality, especially in minority populations, of like darker skin is often considered lesser, lighter is considered better. They've done this in a lot of different communities like Indian, African, etc. So again, there's a lot of different anthropological things you can study by looking at this kind of imagery. And, I used to show this to my students, and some of them would say, well, why do we keep talking about this? And I'm like, it's because stereotypes of race are very prevalent. When the first Obama election happened, I remember seeing these images, which obviously are very stereotypical. The one on the left was something sold at the Republican National Convention. On the right was something sent out by a Republican women's newsletter in California. So people often say, why talk about these things? And I'm like, well, it stays with us more than we'd like to think. It's part of American imaging, for better or for worse. So I think people like Sarah are like, we need to talk about this. We need to think about this, which translates into more contemporary artists like Kara Walker, who basically started making artworks like in the late 90s and is still working today. I love her work. I think it's very unique. She kind of latched on to a working methodology that I think is really different. She creates silhouettes. She does drawings, but she also does these stickers that she creates and sticks onto the walls that create these big dioramas, in a sense, these big installations, right, in a space. And I love this idea of something that's portable, something that can be taken from place to place, and something that's about kind of not quite looking head on at what you're talking about. She talks a lot about how the silhouette is, very stark. It is a black silhouette on a white wall. And she said, I think Americans like to think of things in black and white. You're right or you're wrong. It's good or it's bad. And she says, I've always tried to inhabit the spaces of gray. And I'm a humanities professor, so I'm always inhabiting the spaces of gray. My profession does not allow things to be simple. So I like her work for that reason. I think it forces you to confront horrific images, things that are quite disturbing. And you'll notice that she really revolves around plantation life. She had grown up in California and then had moved to Atlanta, I believe, when she was in high school. And she said it was startling to her as an African American moving from California to Georgia. And she's like, it really impacted like the kind of works I made, this idea of antebellum Southern culture and Gone with the Wind and all these kind of things. She's like, I really just started to think about these two different worlds that exist for African Americans, and the startling kind of contrast, right, that was there. And I love this quote from her that was in an Oprah interview back in 2009. She said, I'm not looking for conclusions or meaning. I'm not interested in that. It's about unleashing the unmentionable, the antisocial, the sociopathic, and then just walking away. And what I notice contemporary artists often do is they have a feeling about their own work, or they have their own opinions. Obviously, as an African American, she has a very specific viewpoint on her work. But I find contemporary artists, they don't try to lead you there. Like, she's like, I'm putting these things there, and then I'm letting you engage with them. And if you find them disturbing, you do. If you don't, you don't. And I find that that's really an attitude that contemporary artists seem to take on, where they're not looking to lead you somewhere. They present something to you and then kind of step back and say, as you like it, for better or for worse. So there's not a lot of preachiness to the work to me. It's just very much like, this is what I think is truth. This is what I think is powerful. Like, I don't know. It can affect you or it cannot, So again, I think her working method's really interesting. What she's struggling with as subject matter is very, very interesting as well. And finally, I wanted to show you in this category, one of my favorites, Fred Wilson. I remember hearing about him when I was in college, that he was going to do this project that you're seeing here. I was doing my undergrad in DC at George Washington, and again, Baltimore is just like right up the road, or like take a train up. And during the time that I was in college, like the late 90s, there was very much this conversation about what do museums do and can we do it better? Do museums have to be these sterile places? I had mentioned that, to me, art should be fun. Art should be interesting. That's my attitude, and it doesn't have to be dry and boring. And I think there was this conversation happening in museums about, like, why do all these museums kind of just have these boring labels on the wall, like you see in this image, right? Metalwork with the dates, just these droning texts of, information, things in vitrines and boxes and on plinths, how can we make history come alive? So Wilson, he basically was talking to the Baltimore Historic Society, and he said, I don't want to make any objects. I just want to use the objects that you have. So hence the title, Mining the Museum. So he was like, I want to, use what's already in your collection and kind of go from there. What he did was create these really powerful images where you have these objects and the relationships that he creates between them. On the left, you have like this beautiful tea service, silver, right? Beautiful, expensive. And then you have slave shackles. It's startling. It makes you think about the two sides of like the slave holding life, right? Of the plantation owners and the slaves themselves. Again, it's not preachy, but you have to step back, at least I do, and go, whoa, like that's pretty damn powerful. And on the right, it's even more powerful. It's called woodwork. You have these chairs from a plantation home facing a post where slaves would have been secured during sale. And they're arranged like they're looking at it. So again, it just hits me as like, it's the simplest thing he could think to do, but he takes these historic objects and makes them into something that you're like, whoa, like that's pretty cool. So notice he doesn't make anything. He creates these relationships between the objects. And that's a whole different way of making that was coming of age when I was leaving college, really end of the 90s into the early 2000s. It was like very revolutionary to consider the fact that, you're not a maker. You're a juxtaposer, you're a positioner. You create these relationships. And I love this quote. Objects, he says, speak to me. I'm trying to root out denial. Museums are afraid of what they will bring to the surface and how people will feel about issues that are long buried. They keep it buried as if it doesn't exist, as though people aren't feeling these things anyway, instead of opening that sore and cleaning it out so it can heal. It's a pretty accurate quote, I think. Again, we often ignore things or hide them, or we're like, okay, it's just too much trouble to deal with this. When culturally, it would be best for us to acknowledge, to say this is what it is. Here are some of his other works. Some where he's actually created things like the glassware you see on the left. I love the juxtaposition of like these blackface figures in a real photograph. He's very smart about what he does and what he's creating. I gave you videos on Carol Walker and him, and I think Fred Wilson. I think them speaking about their work is very powerful. Don't miss them. The next thing, of course, we'll talk about in contemporary art is the idea of new identities.